I actually want to start today's conversation with a question for you.
Yeah.
And it might feel a little rude or maybe a little too personal right out of the gate, but I promise there's a very good reason for it.
Oh, okay. I'm ready. Hit me.
Are you tired?
I mean, is that a trick question? It's the 21st century. Literally everyone is tired.
Right. But I need to be really specific here because I'm not talking about that feeling of, I stayed up way too late binge watching a show, tired.
Right.
And I'm not talking about the physical soreness you get after you help a buddy move a heavy couch or, run a 5K.
Oh, I see where you're going. You're talking about the other thing.
Exactly. The other thing, the heavy thing. It's the sensation that your bones are actually made of lead.
Yeah.
It's the kind of tiredness where you can sleep for 9 solid hours, wake up the next morning, and genuinely feel like you haven't slept in a week. It feels cellular, bone deep.
It is so interesting that you use that specific word, cellular. Because when we started looking into the biology and the neuropsychology for today's topic, it becomes very clear that this specific type of exhaustion is not just a mood.
Right.
It's not a bad attitude. It is an actual, quantifiable biological debt.
A biological debt. That sounds serious.
It is a profound biological debt. And the hook that really grabbed me when we were mapping this out is that most of us walking around today don't even know we are in debt.
Because we're so used to it.
Exactly. We have completely normalized the crisis. We don't even register it as a problem anymore.
There's this analogy we came across that I absolutely loved, and I think it perfectly captures exactly what you're talking about, the hum of the refrigerator.
Oh, that is brilliant. It's so simple, but it hits so hard. So picture your kitchen. You're just sitting there at the table, maybe drinking your morning coffee, the refrigerator's running.
Right, making that low, constant sort of electrical hum.
Yes. And you don't even hear it. It's just room tone. It's the background noise of your life.
You literally filter it out.
You do. But then, let's say a bad storm hits and knocks the power out. The fridge cuts off. And suddenly, complete silence. And it's only in that sudden silence that you realize just how loud that hum actually was the whole time.
Yeah.
You realize you've been shouting over it and trying to think over it, just living over it for years.
And what we're arguing today is that stress, this chronic, low-level, invisible panic, is the hum of the refrigerator.
It absolutely is the background noise of modern life. I mean, we don't even call it stress anymore.
What do we call it?
We just call it Tuesday.
Wow. Yeah.
Or even worse, we internalize it completely into our identity. We say things like, oh, I'm just a high-strung person.
Wow, I'm just naturally anxious. I'm a type A personality.
Exactly. We make a biological crisis into a personality trait.
That part really hit me hard when we were preparing for this. The idea that we build an identity around a dysfunctional state.
And the core thesis we are going to completely unpack today is going to challenge that identity fundamentally. Because the biology suggests you are not broken. You are not just an anxious person.
Okay.
You are over-adapted.
Over-adapted. Now, see, that sounds almost like a compliment, like an evolutionary upgrade. But I have a feeling it really isn't.
Well, it's a biologically neutral term, but the real-world consequences are incredibly heavy.
Yeah.
It basically means you have been running a high-stakes life-or-death survival program in the background of your mental operating system for maybe 20 years. Decades. And you're running it in a modern world that almost never actually requires that level of mobilization.
It's like wearing a full suit of medieval armor to go buy milk at the grocery store?
Precisely. The armor is incredibly heavy. It drains all your energy to just carry it around. And today, we are going to figure out how to take it off.
So we have a massive amount of ground to cover. We're going to look at the raw biology of this, which we're calling the cortisol betrayal. We are going to dive deep into the corporate hallucination, which explains why modern jobs are literally designed to break our nervous systems.
They really are.
And then, importantly, we are going to look at the fix. We are going to build what we call the sovereign body.
And I think we need a quick warning for the listener right up front. We are not doing generic self-care tips today.
No bubble baths, no scented candles.
Exactly. The science is very clear here. We have to completely dismantle the philosophy of suffering and replace it with raw, unforgiving mechanics.
It's an engineering problem.
It is not a feeling problem. It's an engineering problem.
I absolutely love that. So let's get under the hood. I think we need to start with the biology because, honestly, I think we give our bodies a really hard time.
We do. We're so mean to ourselves.
We get mad at our bodies for being stressed. We view it as a weakness.
We treat the human body like it's a rebellious employee that just refuses to get in line and follow orders.
But the truth is, the body is actually kind of a genius, right?
An absolute, undeniable genius. We really have to give the human organism credit here. From an evolutionary standpoint, this stress adaptation is brilliant.
How so?
Well, if you actually live in a literal war zone, your body should be hypervigilant. It should be flooding your system with stress hormones to keep you alive.
Right. So let's talk about the main player here. Let's talk about cortisol. Because if you spend 5 minutes in the online wellness space, you see people treating cortisol like it is literal poison.
Oh, I know. Lower your cortisol. Cortisol is the enemy. Buy my supplement.
Exactly. But it's not the enemy, is it?
Not at all. Cortisol is the ultimate stay-ready hormone. Let's do a quick thought experiment. Let's say you are a hunter-gatherer, maybe 50,000 years ago. You're walking through the woods, and suddenly you see a bear.
Okay. My brain perceives a massive threat.
Instantly. And before you even consciously form the thought that's a bear, your adrenal glands dump a massive payload of cortisol straight into your bloodstream.
And what does that actually do on a physical level? I assume it just makes me run faster.
It does, but it achieves that through 3 very specific, highly coordinated biological mechanisms. First, it mobilizes glucose.
Plus sugar.
Right. It aggressively floods your blood with sugar so that your major muscle groups have instant combustible fuel.
So I have the energy to sprint.
Exactly. Second, it alters your vision. It literally changes the shape of your eyes to sharpen your focus. You get actual tunnel vision, focused entirely on the threat. Your peripheral vision drops away so you don't get distracted.
That's amazing.
And third, and I think this is the craziest part, it numbs pain.
Wait, really? It's a painkiller.
A highly effective one. If you are sprinting away from that bear and you trip and twist your ankle,
Yeah.
you cannot afford to stop and baby it.
Because you'll be eaten.
Right. So the cortisol temporarily blocks the body's natural inflammation response. It shuts off the pain signals. You can literally run on a broken ankle to save your own life.
That is just incredible. It's an absolute miracle drug.
If the threat lasts for 20 minutes, cortisol is the best friend you will ever have. It is the reason our species survived.
But, and I think I see where this is going here, is the modern problem. I am very rarely chased by bears.
I would hope not.
My bears are unread emails. My bears are a passive-aggressive Slack message from my manager at 4:45 on a Friday.
Yeah.
My bears are sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic when I'm already late for daycare pickup.
And that right there is the crux of the entire modern exhaustion epidemic. Your nervous system is ancient. It is primitive. It does not understand the conceptual difference between a prehistoric predator and a modern corporate deadline.
So it reacts the exact same way.
It treats all perceived threats as literal biological life or death threats. So when your phone buzzes and you see an email subject line that just says, "We need to talk," your body reacts.
It dumps the glucose.
It dumps the glucose. It sharpens the vision to stare at the screen. It numbs your system. It prepares you to sprint for your life or fight to the death.
But I don't run. I don't punch my computer. I just sit in my ergonomic desk chair.
Exactly. You mobilize all of this incredible explosive energy to fight for your survival, and then you just sit perfectly still.
Just bottling it all up.
You sit there and you marinate in that intensely toxic chemical cocktail. And the fundamental problem is that this biological mechanism is perfectly designed for a 20-minute sprint.
But it is catastrophic for a 20-year career.
Catastrophic. And this exact dynamic leads to what the data calls the sensitization effect.
Also known as the Kindling Effect. Let's break this down because it goes against everything we are taught about mental toughness.
It really is counterintuitive. We have this pervasive cultural myth that stress makes us tougher. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right. The idea that if we just push through a high-stress job for 10 years, we'll build up a callus, we'll get thick skin.
I can handle anything now. I'm a veteran of the grind. We hear it all the time, but the biology tells a completely different story. The biology says the exact opposite is true.
How so?
Chronic exposure to cortisol doesn't turn your nervous system into stone, it turns it into kindling, dry wood. Think about the mechanics of starting a campfire. If you take a match and hold it up to a massive damp oak log, what happens?
Nothing happens. The max just burns out.
Right. It takes an incredible amount of sustained heat to get a wet log to catch fire. That damp log is a healthy, regulated nervous system.
It can absorb a shock without igniting.
Exactly. But now imagine you have a pile of bone-dry pine needles. Just absolute kindling. What happens when you drop a single tiny spark onto that pile?
Whoosh. Absolute inferno. Instantly.
That is your nervous system. After years of chronic stress, you do not become bulletproof. You become highly flammable.
And this explains what we call the threshold drop.
Yes, the threshold drop is why minor inconveniences suddenly feel like massive tragedies.
Is this why, for example, I spilled a few drops of coffee on my shirt last week and literally had to fight back the urge to sit on the floor and cry?
Yes, that is the perfect example because logically, the thinking part of your brain knows exactly what is happening. You think it is just coffee. I own a washing machine. This is a $5 t-shirt. It is fine.
But my body completely disagreed.
Your body was already operating at 99% capacity.
Yeah.
Your baseline stress was hovering right below the red line. That tiny spill of coffee was just the 1% spark that pushed your biology over the edge into full fight or flight.
And then immediately after the panic comes the shame.
Always.
I'm just standing there in my kitchen, holding a paper towel. My heart is absolutely pounding against my ribs like I just escaped a mugging. And I'm thinking to myself, what is wrong with you? You are a grown adult. Why can't you handle a minor stain?
And that shame you feel, that is what we call the logic gap. We desperately try to outthink our own nervous system.
We try to logic our way out of a panic attack.
We try to use rational thought to calm down a purely biological response. But the science is incredibly blunt about this. Your nervous system does not speak English.
It doesn't understand reason.
It doesn't speak French. It doesn't speak logic. It doesn't care about your rationalization.
So what language does it speak?
It speaks a very ancient language called felt safety.
Felt safety.
Yes. Inside understanding why you are upset is a cognitive process. It happens in the prefrontal cortex, which is the highly evolved thinking part of the brain. But safety is somatic. It happens down in the body, in the older parts of the brain.
So knowing isn't feeling.
Not at all. You can literally write a PhD dissertation on exactly why you were stressed. You can sit in therapy and perfectly map out all your childhood trauma and your workplace triggers.
And you can still be completely wired and exhausted.
Because intellectually knowing that you are safe in your house is not the same biological experience as actually feeling safe in your body.
This massive disconnect between the logical brain and the stressed body, this inability to actually feel safe, this is what creates the terror of stillness, isn't it?
Oh, this is the big one. This is probably the most common symptom of chronic overadaptation that I see. Let me set a scene, and you tell me if this sounds vaguely familiar.
Okay, lay it on me.
It is a Saturday morning. You have somehow magically finished all your household chores. The kids are either asleep or at a friend's house. You have absolutely zero obligations for the next 3 hours.
A total dream scenario. I should be deeply relaxing on the couch.
But what are you actually doing in reality?
In reality, I am speed walking around my kitchen. I am eating my lunch, standing up, hunched over the sink, and I am furiously scrolling through my phone like I am searching for the nuclear launch codes.
You are vibrating. You are physically humming with anxious energy.
I absolutely am. I literally cannot force myself to just sit down and do nothing.
And that right there is the absolute hallmark of a nervous system that has been hot-wired for speed. When being on high alert becomes your normal baseline, actual safety starts to feel suspicious.
Silence feels like a trap.
Exactly. Why does it feel like a trap?
Because if you slow down, the hum of the refrigerator stops.
And suddenly, you're forced to hear the terrifying noise inside your own head. You're forced to feel the vibration of your own unprocessed anxiety.
So as long as we're rushing, we can outrun it.
But the second you stop, it catches up to you.
So we just keep moving to avoid the inevitable crash. We invent tasks.
We invent fires to put out. Or we dissociate.
Let's talk about the dissociation piece. The Netflix and scroll dissociation.
Just look at how the average person consumes media today. You decide to relax, so you put a movie on the TV.
Right.
But you don't actually just sit and watch the movie. You watch the movie on the big screen while simultaneously scrolling through Instagram on your phone while also texting your group chat.
I feel personally attacked right now. I do this every single night.
Millions of people do.
Right.
Because doing just one single thing, just sitting and watching a screen, is way too close to stillness.
It leaves too much mental bandwidth open.
Exactly. If you just watch the movie, your mind might accidentally wander back to your actual life. You might feel a bodily sensation.
God forbid.
So you intentionally occupy your eyes with the television and your hands with the smartphone to construct a solid wall of digital noise.
You are actively numbing yourself. You aren't actually resting.
It is anesthetic, not rest.
That is just terrifyingly accurate. But I think it's important to point out that we can't just blame our biology for this, right?
No.
because we didn't just spontaneously decide to be this way in a vacuum. We are being actively trained and incentivized to behave this way.
We're being conditioned. And that brings us right into the environment where we spend the vast majority of our waking hours.
The workplace. Which leads us perfectly into section 2, the corporate hallucination.
I love this section because the data has a very dark, very cynical, but ultimately hilarious take on corporate culture. It basically argues that your entire job description is a complete fabrication.
How so? Walk me through that.
In the modern white-collar knowledge economy, you really weren't hired for your technical skills. I mean, obviously your college degree or your resume is what got you in the door for the interview.
Sure, you have to know how to use the software.
But fundamentally, on a day-to-day basis, you are not really being paid to build pivot tables in Excel or write lines of code. You were essentially hired to not freak out.
To not freak out. The smile through chaos doctrine.
Precisely. Just think about the actual hardest part of your typical workday. Is it the technical execution of a specific task?
Rarely.
Or is it sitting in a mandatory hour-long Zoom meeting where 3 different managers are aggressively arguing about a marketing strategy that makes zero logical sense, where the instructions you were given are completely contradictory, the timeline is physically impossible, and your core job requirement in that moment is to just sit there and nod politely?
And then right after the meeting, having to type up an email that starts with, "Thanks so much for the robust feedback," when what you actually want to type is, well, something highly unprofessional.
Exactly. That massive invisible gap between the primal scream echoing inside your own head and the pleasant professional smile plastered on your face, that gap is what we call emotional labor.
Emotional labor. This is Arlie Hochschild's concept, right?
Yes, she coined the term, and it perfectly described the intense psychological effort required to constantly manage and suppress your true feelings in order to fit a rigid professional expectation.
It's basically a full-time acting gig.
It is deep acting. And here is the brutal truth. It is biologically expensive. In the modern corporate hierarchy, emotional composure is actually the strongest and most valuable currency.
Think about your average CEO.
Are they usually the absolute smartest, most technically gifted person in the entire company?
Almost never. Usually there's an engineer somewhere who's way smarter.
Right, but the CEO is almost always the most numb.
Numb. That's a strong word.
They are the individuals who possess the terrifying ability to endure chronically toxic levels of ambiguity, intense pressure, and interpersonal conflict without ever breaking a sweat or showing a crack in the armor.
So we literally promote people based on their capacity to successfully suppress their own nervous systems.
We reward biological suppression with stock options. But that suppression comes with a massive hidden cost. You mentioned the phrase earlier, emotive dissonance.
Yes, emotive dissonance. Let's dig into that because this blew my mind.
When you are aggressively forcing yourself to smile politely at a client while internally you are vibrating with pure rage, that creates a profound internal dissonance.
And it's not just a psychological annoyance.
No, that dissonance is physically inflammatory. Holding 2 completely conflicting biological states at the exact same time causes massive systemic inflammation throughout your entire body.
It's hurting us physically.
It radically dysregulates your immune system. It spikes your blood pressure. It is a literal biological tax that your body pays every single time you type the phrase, "per my last email."
And if you keep paying that brutal biological tax day after day, year after year, eventually you just go totally bankrupt.
You hit the wall. You burn out.
But the concept of burnout is incredibly misunderstood, isn't it? We need to completely redefine what burnout actually means in this context.
We really do. Culturally, we tend to think that burnout simply means I worked way too many hours this week, or I did too much physical labor.
Right, we treat it like an overuse injury, like a pitcher throwing too many fastballs and blowing out his shoulder.
But in the knowledge economy, true burnout is rarely about the physical hours logged. It is actually a neurological backlog.
A neurological backlog. Tell the story about the neurologist from Zurich that illustrates this perfectly.
It's a fascinating clinical case study. There was a prominent neurologist in Zurich, and he had a patient come to him, a highly successful young doctor.
Okay.
And she came into his clinic absolutely desperate, saying, "I am dying. I am totally, hopelessly exhausted. I can barely function."
So you would naturally assume she's working what, 100-hour weeks in an ER?
That is the wild part. She wasn't. She had actually intentionally cut back her clinical hours to part-time. She was physically in bed, sleeping for 9 solid hours every single night.
So physically, on paper, she was resting?
On paper, she was doing everything right. But she was waking up every morning feeling physically destroyed.
Mm.
So the neurologist decided to run some tests and heavily monitor her daily brain activity.
And what did they find?
They discovered that even though she was working fewer hours, she was spending roughly 70% of her waking day engaged in micro-worry.
Micro-worry. What exactly does that look like in practice?
Micro-worry is the invisible, crushing weight of uncompleted work. It's standing in the shower at 6 a.m., intensely rehearsing an imaginary confrontation you might have with a colleague later that week.
Oh, man.
It's driving home from the grocery store and suddenly obsessively replaying a minor mistake you made in a presentation 3 full years ago.
It's cooking dinner while carrying on a full-blown, aggressive debate with your boss entirely inside your own head. Look, I am incredibly guilty of the shower arguments. I have eloquently won so many complex shower arguments.
We all have. It's human nature. But here's the biological catch. Your brain burns a massive amount of physical glucose when it engages in deep thought.
Just like a muscle.
Exactly. Now, actual tangible work is finite. You draft the memo, you click send on the email, the task is officially complete.
Here's an endpoint.
But micro-worry is infinite. It is a closed loop. It never actually resolves because you are fighting a ghost.
The analogy they used for this was the laptop left on standby.
Yes. Think about your work laptop. You finish your tasks for the day and you just slam the lid shut, but you don't actually power the machine down.
Right.
What happens?
Yep.
You put it in your backpack and 2 hours later you reach in and the laptop is burning hot to the touch. The internal fan is loudly whirring
The battery is completely draining.
because the programs are all still secretly running in the background. That overheating laptop is your brain on chronic micro-worry. You are silently draining your metabolic batteries just as rapidly as if you were sitting at your desk actively working.
So the terrifying reality is that even when we are officially off the clock, our nervous system is still fully on.
Exactly. The Zurich neurologist actually published the brain scans to prove this. If you look at a crisis brain, a brain that just successfully navigated a real, tangible emergency, it lives highly activated, but structurally intact.
It geared up, did the job, and geared down.
Right. But an overthinking brain, a chronically ruminating brain engaged in non-stop micro-worry, looks physically inflamed. The imaging shows it as cloudy and foggy.
Because the biological stress cycle was triggered, but it was never allowed to close.
It's just endlessly spinning its wheels, burning fuel, and creating toxic heat.
Okay, so we're really painting a bleak picture here. We have the cortisol betrayal actively turning our nervous system into dry kindling.
Yep.
We have the corporate hallucination forcing us to suppress our emotions, which creates this massive neurological backlog. We are essentially a highly functional mess.
A very well-dressed mess.
So to begin fixing this, we need a map. We have to understand exactly where we are biologically at any given moment.
And that brings us to section 3, the architecture of survival.
This is where the deep dive gets into Polyvagal Theory. Now, I have to be completely honest with you. Whenever I hear the word polyvagal, my eyes immediately start to glaze over.
It sounds incredibly clinical and dense.
It sounds like I need a medical degree just to understand my own mood.
It does. But I promise you, it is actually the most practical, user-friendly map you will ever find for navigating your own internal state. The first thing we have to do is completely stop thinking about the human nervous system as a simple on-off switch.
It's not just stress versus calm.
No, that binary is a myth.
Yeah.
Polyvagal theory reveals that the nervous system is not a switch. It is a ladder.
Okay, a ladder. Paint that picture for me. Let's assume right now I am at the absolute bottom of this ladder.
Let's actually start up at the very top. The top rung of the ladder is what we call the ventral vagal state.
Ventral vagal.
Right. Think of this as the luxurious penthouse suite of your nervous system.
Nice. What's the general vibe up in the penthouse?
The vibe is pure connection, deep safety, and open curiosity. When you are operating from the top of the ladder, your heart rate is perfectly regulated.
You feel grounded.
You feel incredibly grounded. You have the actual biological capacity to hear what we call a prosody in someone else's voice.
Prosody, like the musicality, the tone.
Yes, the subtle emotional shifts in pitch and rhythm. You can easily read complex facial cues. You can empathize and connect with other humans. Biologically, this is the state of rest and digest.
This sounds lovely. This is where everyone wants to live full-time.
It is the goal. But life happens. Suddenly your phone dings, the email comes in, the proverbial bear suddenly appears in the woods.
And what happens? I fall down the stairs.
You quickly slide down one rung of the ladder, you leave the penthouse, and you drop into the sympathetic state.
Sympathetic, that's the famous fight or flight response.
Exactly. This is pure biological mobilization. This is what we call the bank of chaos.
The bank of chaos. I know this place intimately.
We all do.
Yeah.
Now, it's crucial to notice what physically happens as you slide down into the sympathetic state. Biological systems start aggressively going offline to save power.
Like what?
In a sympathetic fight or flight state, your prefrontal cortex, the advanced logical thinking part of your brain, actually starts to dim down.
Wait, really? You become less rational?
You literally become temporarily less intelligent.
That explains so much about my past relationships.
Right. Your primitive brain takes over and aggressively says, listen, we do not need to solve complex algebra right now. We need to physically punch a tiger in the face.
Survival first, logic second.
So the body physically diverts blood flow and oxygen away from the advanced logic and empathy centers of the brain and pushes it outward to your major muscle groups.
This is exactly why you say incredibly stupid, hurtful things in the middle of a heated argument that you immediately regret an hour later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You literally were not thinking. Your thinking brain was starved of blood. You were purely reacting from a state of ancient survival mechanics.
Okay, so that is the sympathetic rung, fight or flight. But what happens if fighting or running isn't an option? What's below that?
This is where it gets really dark. If the fight or flight response fails, let's say the bear actually catches you, or in a modern context, the chronic stress at work is just too overwhelmingly massive to fight against you. Completely slide off the rungs and crash onto the very bottom of the ladder.
And what is the bottom called?
The dorsal vagal state.
The basement.
The cold, dark dungeon. This is pure biological shutdown. This is the body pulling the emergency brake on your existence.
What does that look like in the wild?
In the natural world, this is the classic image of the gazelle suddenly going limp and playing dead while it's in the lion's mouth. It is a total involuntary biological collapse.
But how does that ancient collapse mechanism translate to a modern human sitting in a cubicle?
It manifests as profound emotional numbness.
Yeah.
Deep dissociation.
Depression.
Apathy, depression, yes. It's that terrifying feeling when you are staring blankly at your computer screen and the words just look like meaningless shapes. They aren't registering.
Your body feels incredibly heavy.
You feel hopeless. You have zero access to your own motivation. You just want to physically crawl underneath your desk, curl into a ball, and sleep for a week.
And it's critical to note that this isn't resting, is it?
Not at all. It is not restful recovery. It is a systemic collapse. It's a circuit breaker tripping to prevent the entire house from burning down.
And right here is where the concept of the window of tolerance comes into play, right? How does that fit with the ladder?
It fits perfectly. Imagine a physical window frame. The space inside that open frame represents your ideal zone of regulation.
So when I'm inside the window, I'm okay.
When you're operating inside that window, you can comfortably handle the normal ups and downs of daily life without immediately tumbling out of the penthouse.
I can experience stress, but I don't lose my mind.
Exactly. You stay present and capable.
But our modern problem is that our window is rapidly shrinking.
Years of chronic, unmanaged stress physically narrows the dimensions of that window. It shrinks the frame down tighter and tighter until it is basically just a tiny slit.
Which means any slight movement knocks you out of the frame.
Precisely. Because the window is so incredibly narrow, you don't really experience normal emotional ups and downs anymore. You just violently bounce back and forth.
From what to what?
From severe hyperarousal, which is the explosive rage, the sheer panic, the sympathetic fight or flight, instantly over to hyperarousal.
Which is the numbness, the dorsal vagal collapse.
You completely lose the stable middle ground.
So we are essentially just spending our entire lives ping-ponging violently between screaming at traffic and collapsing on the couch in a numb stupor.
Sadly, yes. That is the reality for millions of people. And the ultimate goal of somatic healing, which we're going to get into soon, is not to magically become perfectly zen 24 hours a day.
Because being perfectly calm all the time isn't realistic.
It's actually a flat line. It's a form of death. The real tangible goal is simply to widen the window of tolerance.
To build a sturdier ladder.
To make the ladder strong enough that you can occasionally climb down into the chaos to deal with a real problem, and then successfully climb back up to the penthouse without slipping and falling into the basement.
But before we can actually begin the work to widen that window, we have to look backward. We have to clearly understand exactly how that window got so drastically narrowed in the first place.
We do. We have to find the root cause.
And for that, we have to go back to the very beginning. We are moving into section 4, the origin story.
And I have to say, This specific part of the research hit me incredibly close to home.
Me too. It dives deep into early childhood development, and it revolves around a phrase that honestly gave me chills the first time I read it: the tragic transaction.
The tragic transaction. This profound concept is heavily credited to Dr. Gabor Mate, and it is the absolute key to understanding why some of us are vastly more prone to this chronic burnout than others.
It's not just random bad luck.
No, it starts from day one. As a young human child, you have two fundamental, completely non-negotiable biological needs.
What are those two core needs?
The first need is attachment, and the second need is authenticity.
Let's define this clearly.
Attachment is pure survival. As an infant, you literally cannot feed yourself, clothe yourself, or protect yourself from danger. You absolutely need your parents or caregivers to love you and keep you close. If you lose attachment, you biologically die.
Okay, so attachment equals survival. What about authenticity?
Authenticity is the vital ability to be deeply in touch with your own internal gut feelings. It's knowing what you naturally feel, knowing what you desire, and freely expressing who you truly are.
So we need both. But sometimes in the real world, those two absolute needs come into direct conflict.
They conflict all the time. Imagine a normal toddler. He's deeply frustrated about something, so he gets angry. He throws a loud, messy tantrum in the middle of the grocery store.
In that moment, the child is just being purely authentic to his feelings.
He is expressing authentic rage. But his parent is understandably exhausted, maybe deeply stressed about money, or perhaps dealing with their own unhealed trauma.
So the parent snaps.
The parent rigidly shouts, "Stop crying right now. Good boys do not get angry. If you don't stop, I am leaving you here."
Wow. So in that split second, the young child is suddenly forced to make an impossible choice.
And it is completely subconscious, but it is a brutally real biological choice. The child's primitive brain quickly calculates the math. If I choose to be authentic, if I continue to freely express my anger, my parent will withdraw their love. I will lose the attachment. And if I lose the attachment, I will literally die.
So the child chooses attachment every single time.
They have to. Survival always trumps self-expression. The young child will actively amputate a vital piece of their own soul. They will bury their authentic anger just to keep their parent calm and maintain the lifeline of attachment.
And that profound internal sacrifice is the tragic transaction.
I will willingly cut off this messy, authentic part of myself in order to stay safely connected to you.
That is just heartbreaking to think about. And this early, desperate transaction creates rigid behavioral archetypes that we unwittingly carry with us all the way into adulthood, right into our marriages and our corporate jobs.
They become our default operating systems.
The deep dive specifically highlights two major archetypes. Let's start with the one they call the nice guy.
Let's call our hypothetical nice guy Gary.
Okay, Gary.
As a young kid, little Gary quickly learned that having personal boundaries was incredibly dangerous. He learned that every time he said no or asserted his own needs, his mother became deeply upset or emotionally withdrew.
So to survive, little Gary proactively amputated his ability to say no.
He traded his boundaries for attachment.
Fast forward 30 years. Now Gary is 35 years old. What does his life look like?
Gary is outwardly a very sweet guy, but he is completely miserable. He is the ultimate exhausting peacekeeper. At the office, he constantly stays late doing everyone else's uncompleted work because he literally cannot bear to cause friction.
And in his personal life?
In his romantic relationships, he is constantly being mothered by his partners because he completely lacks the rigid spine required to actually lead or assert a preference.
He's a total doormat.
But the terrifying part is what is happening internally. Because Gary's authentic rage didn't just magically evaporate into thin air when he was a kid.
Where did it go?
It was forced down into the dorsal vagal basement. It went underground. So outwardly, Gary is smiling and agreeing. But internally, he is a highly pressurized, boiling volcano of suppressed, toxic rage.
And it's slowly eating him alive from the inside out.
He's destroying his health.
Okay, so that's Gary. On the complete flip side of the coin, we have the second archetype, the intensely driven, hyper-independent person, the boss babe.
Let's call her Sarah.
Okay, Sarah's story.
Sarah grew up in a house with a father who was severely emotionally unavailable. Maybe he was an obsessed workaholic who was never home, or maybe he was an active alcoholic.
So he was physically there, maybe, but emotionally completely vacant.
Exactly. And through painful trial and error, young Sarah learned a very different lesson than Gary. She learned that vulnerability is dangerous. She learned that needing things or asking for comfort only ever led to crushing disappointment and emotional pain.
So Sarah made a different tragic transaction. She decided to completely amputate her own needs.
She became entirely needless. She traded vulnerability for the safety of isolation.
And what does adult Sarah look like today?
Oh, outwardly, she is terrifyingly impressive. She's a high-achieving executive. She demands to do absolutely everything herself. Her entire adult mantra is, "I do not need anyone's help."
She is a fortress.
But here's the tragic, self-sabotaging kicker for Sarah. She desperately wants love, but she consistently, almost magnetically, keeps dating men who are just as emotionally unavailable as her father was.
Why on earth does she keep doing that? If she logically hates that feeling of distance, why does she actively, repeatedly choose it?
Because her deeply conditioned nervous system recognizes that cold emotional distance as home.
It feels familiar.
It feels incredibly familiar, and to a dysregulated nervous system, familiar is mistakenly coded as safe.
Even if the familiar thing is actively hurting her.
Exactly. If Sarah actually met a truly available, kind, highly communicative partner, her nervous system would panic. She would instantly feel what pop culture calls the ick.
She would feel completely suffocated and run away.
She is subconsciously locked in a cycle, continually seeking out the exact agonizing dynamic she barely survived as a vulnerable child, hoping to finally win the game this time.
This psychological framework brings us to a really fascinating redefinition of a word we use all the time, the concept of ego.
Yes, this is a massive paradigm shift.
Because culturally, when we hear the word ego, we immediately think of loud arrogance. We think, oh, that guy is so full of himself, he has a massive ego.
Right, we equate it with narcissism. But in deep somatic trauma work, the ego is not viewed as arrogance at all. The ego is simply armor.
Armor.
It is a heavy, rusted, suffocating suit of iron armor that you desperately constructed and put on when you were 5 years old to physically prevent yourself from being emotionally abandoned.
It's the collection of fake masks you wear to navigate a dangerous world.
It is entirely a defense mechanism. It is Gary's fake, accommodating smile, and it is Sarah's icy, untouchable independence. Both are ego. Both are heavy armor.
And making the conscious decision to finally take that heavy armor off as an adult is absolutely terrifying.
It feels like stepping out of a bunker into a war zone, completely naked.
Which perfectly explains why the data strongly emphasizes that the simple act of saying the word no is actually a profound medical intervention.
Saying no is a radical physiological intervention. It is not just a trendy time management hack you read in a productivity blog.
How does saying no actually change the biology?
Think back to Gary. When Gary finally summons the courage to look his demanding boss in the eye and say, "No, I cannot take on that extra weekend project," he isn't simply politely declining a minor clerical task.
What is he actually doing?
He is bravely reaching back in time and actively reversing the tragic transaction of his childhood. In that exact moment, he is speaking directly to his own terrified nervous system, saying, "I am an adult now. I am big enough to protect you. Today, I courageously choose my own authenticity over the desperate need for their attachment."
That is unbelievably powerful, but it also sounds intensely scary to actually execute.
It is utterly terrifying. The first time you do it, your body will absolutely scream at you in protest. Your heart will hammer, your hands will shake. Your primitive brain will be convinced that you are literally going to die because you broke the ancient survival rule.
You just have to sit in the fire and survive the panic.
Yes, because stepping into that fear is the only known way to actually widen that shrinking window of tolerance.
Okay, so let's play this out. Let's say the listener is fully on board. We start doing this hard work. We begin setting firm boundaries. We bravely start saying no. We intentionally try to slow our lives down. We make the active decision to heal our nervous system.
Right, you commit to the process.
The research has a massive flashing neon warning sign for us right here, which brings us to section 5, the messy middle.
I cannot emphasize this section enough. This is objectively the most dangerous part of the entire journey. This is the exact spot where 90% of people completely abandon the process and regress.
Why? What is the paradox of healing?
The brutal paradox is this. When you finally manage to stop the external chaos of your life, you are immediately going to feel drastically worse.
Wait, we really need to unpack that. Why on earth would we feel worse? That sounds like a terrible deal. I thought the whole point was to feel better.
Because, remember the chemistry. We are biologically, chemically addicted to our own potent stress hormones.
Right, the cortisol and adrenaline.
If you have been chronically redlining your internal engine on high-octane cortisol and adrenaline every single day for 20 consecutive years, Sudden peace does not feel relaxing. Peace feels like severe chemical withdrawal.
So it's literally akin to a drug addict suddenly getting clean, like coming off a massive caffeine or nicotine habit.
Exactly like that, but arguably much stronger because the drugs are being manufactured internally by your own glands. To a highly dysregulated nervous system, sustained peace feels terrifyingly flat. It feels agonizingly boring. Honestly, it feels like death.
And this uncomfortable void leads directly into what they call the boredom crisis.
The boredom crisis. We fundamentally misinterpret true biological peace as a dangerous emptiness.
Because the refrigerator hum is gone?
Exactly. The noise stopped, and we panic. So what do we subconsciously do to fix the uncomfortable quiet?
Let me guess. We start actively inventing new fires to put out.
We self-sabotage. You will be sitting in a perfectly quiet, lovely room on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Everything in your life is actually going wonderfully.
But you feel an itch.
You feel this uncontrollable, crawling itch deep in your skin, an irrational urge to randomly pick a vicious fight with your supportive partner over how they load the dishwasher.
Or a sudden, desperate compulsion to aggressively check your corporate email account, hoping for a crisis, just to manufacture a hit of adrenaline.
Just to quickly get that familiar vibrating hum back online. Because chaos is the only state where you actually know how to function.
This part is so crucial. The data explicitly outlines 3 distinct fake setbacks that frequently occur during this messy middle phase. This specific segment went incredibly viral online recently because it is just so painfully accurate.
It resonated with everyone.
I want us to slowly walk through each of these 3 fake setbacks so people can recognize them and desperately try not to freak out when they inevitably happen.
Absolutely. Let's start with fake setback number 1. The crash.
The crash. What exactly does that physically look and feel like?
Imagine you finally manage to downregulate. Safety legitimately arrives in your life. The toxic job is over, or the bad relationship ends. Your body finally, deeply realizes that it can stop aggressively fighting for survival.
The Phantom War is officially over.
Right. So, biologically, what do frontline soldiers inevitably do the absolute second the long war is declared over?
They drop their weapons and they completely collapse.
They collapse. And that is exactly what your body does. You get hit with this bone-crushing, absolutely debilitating exhaustion.
The kind where you sleep for 12 straight hours, drag yourself out of bed, and still feel like you were violently hit by a freight train.
Yes. And your immediate panic thought is, oh my God, I am losing my edge. I'm becoming lazy. I am fundamentally broken. But you aren't broken. You are finally repairing. Think of it like a major interstate highway. If the road crew needs to fundamentally repair deep structural potholes, they have to completely shut down all the lanes of traffic.
You can't rebuild a road while cars are driving on it at 80 miles an hour.
Exactly. The exhaustion is just your body putting up the detour signs. You are simply in mandatory maintenance mode.
That reframing is incredibly helpful. Okay, let's look at fake setback number 2, the resurfacing.
The resurfacing. This one is incredibly tricky and emotionally painful. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, incredibly old symptoms violently come back to life.
Like what kind of symptoms?
You might suddenly experience a massive, paralyzing panic attack, even though you haven't had a single one in over a decade. Or a profound wave of fresh grief from a romantic breakup that happened 5 whole years ago just violently hits you while you're standing in line at the supermarket.
And when that happens, it feels like total regression. You immediately think, I did years of therapy. I thought I successfully dealt with this garbage.
It feels like a massive failure, but it is actually the opposite. It is not regression. It is finally safely processing.
How does that work?
Your body is incredibly smart. It was safely holding all of that toxic grief and unexpressed panic deep in the dorsal vagal backlog. Because back then, when the event actually happened, it was biologically entirely too dangerous to fully feel it.
You didn't have the capacity to process it at the time without breaking.
Right, but now that you've done the work, now that your window of tolerance is a little wider and you are finally genuinely safe, the body competently says, okay, the perimeter is secure. We finally have the necessary bandwidth to let this old poison out.
So the old pain is finally coming up to leave the body, not to stay and punish you.
Beautifully said, yes.
Okay, that brings us to the final one. Fake setback number 3.
Hyperawareness, also affectionately known as the terrifying hypochondriac phase.
Oh, I know this one intimately. What happens here?
As you heal, you suddenly become excruciatingly aware of every single tiny biological function inside your body. You intensely notice every single flutter of your heartbeat,
Every random muscle twitch in your calf.
every vague, weird sensation in your digestive tract,
Mm-hmm.
and your anxious brain immediately assumes the absolute worst.
You become entirely convinced that you have a rare terminal illness.
I have definitely been there, frantically Googling obscure medical symptoms at 2 in the morning in a cold sweat.
We all have, but the biological reality is you are actually just slowly thawing out from years of dorsal numbness.
Thawing out. I like that.
A truly healing nervous system always forcefully dials up your internal physical awareness way before it manages to successfully dial down your emotional reactivity.
So you feel everything louder before it gets quieter.
Exactly.
Oh.
You fundamentally have to be able to feel the physical body in order to properly heal the physical body. You are just finally registering the normal background noise of your own organs that was actually always there. But because the loud hum of the stress refrigerator is finally gone, I can suddenly hear every little creak in the house.
It perfectly connects right back to the corporate backlog analogy we discussed earlier.
The overflowing email inbox.
Right. Imagine your poor brain is literally an email inbox flooded with 10,000 deeply urgent, unread messages.
That is a nightmare scenario.
Chronic rumination is just you frantically hitting the refresh button over and over again, staring at the number 10,000. True somatic healing is the painstaking, grueling process of finally sitting down and actually opening every single one of those terrifying emails.
It is going to be incredibly messy.
It is overwhelmingly messy. It feels awful. But it is literally the only physical way to finally clear the inbox.
So practically speaking, how do we actually start clearing that massive inbox? Because we desperately need a reliable toolkit.
We do.
And the research is wildly explicitly clear on one major point here. Pure logic entirely fails us in this arena. Which brings us perfectly to section 6, the toolkit.
This is where the rubber meets the road. The core mantra here is, you cannot possibly think your way out of a thinking loop.
Right. Because if my mind is the specific machine that is fundamentally broken, I obviously cannot use that exact same broken machine to successfully fix itself.
It's a paradox. You desperately need what we call a physical interrupt.
A physical interrupt.
Yes, you literally have to aggressively use the raw mechanics of your physical body to quickly shock your brain completely offline and force a hard reboot of the system.
Okay, give us the actual practical how-to. What are the specific somatic tools we can aggressively deploy right now when we feel the panic rising in the middle of a miserable office building or when we are trapped in our car?
Let's start with tool number 1, which is my absolute favorite. Cold water.
Cold water, like splashing water on your face.
Exactly. When you feel the overwhelming sympathetic panic start to viciously spike, you immediately get up, briskly walk to the nearest bathroom, turn the faucet to the absolute coldest setting, and aggressively splash freezing cold water directly onto your face.
Or, I've heard you can hold a literal freezing ice cube tightly in your bare hand until it becomes physically uncomfortable.
Yes, that works beautifully too.
But what is the actual biological science behind that? Why does shocking myself with cold actually help calm my brain down?
It forcefully triggers an ancient, hardwired biological mechanism called the mammalian dive reflex.
The dive reflex.
Yes, when freezing cold water suddenly hits the sensitive nerve receptors on your face, your primitive brain is instantly tricked into believing that you have just fully submerged yourself deep underwater.
Oh, wow.
And instantly, completely bypassing your logical thoughts, your body forcefully overrides the panic and drastically slows your heart rate down in a desperate bid to aggressively conserve oxygen.
So it's literally a hardwired biological override switch for a panic attack.
It is a phenomenal emergency brake. It violently snaps you right out of the terrifying mental loop and aggressively anchors you directly back into your raw physical body.
I really love that one because it's so immediate. Okay, what else is in the somatic toolkit?
Tool number 2 is something we call the squeeze.
The squeeze. Walk me through it.
This is all about aggressive physiological compression. When you are sitting in a highly stressful environment and you feel the toxic tension rapidly building up, you intentionally lean into it.
You don't try to relax?
No, trying to force relaxation usually just creates more anxiety.
Yeah.
Instead, you violently clench every single voluntary muscle in your entire body.
So I clench my fists.
You clench your fists until your knuckles turn totally white. You aggressively curl your toes inside your shoes. You rigidly scrunch up your face. You tightly flex your stomach muscles.
Okay.
You hold all of that extreme, agonizing physical tension as tightly as humanly possible for 10 agonizing seconds. You literally let your body intensely shake with the sheer effort of the applied tension.
And then?
And then you suddenly completely release everything all at once. You totally collapse.
What does that violent contrast actually accomplish neurologically?
It forcefully forces the biological pendulum to swing in the opposite direction. You see, you cannot possibly teach a chronically stressed nervous system how to actually relax if it has completely forgotten what deep tension and deep release even practically feel like.
By intentionally exaggerating the extreme tension to a ridiculous degree, it makes the subsequent release feel vastly deeper and more profound.
Exactly. You are actively taking back the steering wheel and commanding the tension rather than passively letting the tension command you.
Okay, that makes total sense. Now what about the third one? They call it the shake.
The shake. To deeply understand this one, you just have to look at how wild animals naturally operate.
Back to the gazelle and the lion.
Right. If a wild gazelle miraculously manages to outrun a hungry lion and successfully escapes, what does it physically do once it reaches safety?
I assume it doesn't just calmly walk away and immediately start peacefully eating grass as if nothing horrific just happened.
Exactly. It does not. Before it does anything else, the gazelle stands there and violently, uncontrollably shakes its entire physical body for a solid minute.
Why?
It is rapidly, physically discharging all of the explosive, mobilized survival energy that was dumped into its system by the cortisol. It is physically burning off the toxic chemical cocktail.
But we modern humans, we don't do that at all, do we?
We do the exact toxic opposite. We bravely hold it all in, we rigidly stiffen our spines, we actively swallow the intense panic, casually adjust our professional ties, and sit perfectly still in our ergonomic office chairs while the potent chemicals aggressively eat a hole in our stomach lining.
So the practical application is to literally just physically shake.
Literally. Stand up right behind your desk, aggressively shake your hands like you were trying to fling water off your fingertips, forcefully shake out your legs, close your blinds, and wildly dance around your kitchen like an absolute lunatic for 3 straight minutes.
I love that. You basically just have to be totally willing to look completely ridiculous in order to actually feel physically better.
You absolutely do. You physically have to aggressively get that trapped, toxic survival energy fully out of your muscular system.
There is one more extremely practical tool in this section that I really want to highlight because I think it could profoundly change people's daily lives. The 2-minute car sit.
Oh, this is absolutely vital for anyone who works a highly demanding, chronically stressful job and then has to transition back to a family.
It's all about managing the physical transition between worlds.
Exactly. When you finally endure a brutal workday, navigate horrible traffic, and you finally pull into your own driveway at home, what is your normal instinct?
My immediate instinct is to just grab my heavy bag, quickly rush straight through the front door, and immediately start frantically dealing with the kids, the loud dog, and cooking dinner.
Right. And by doing that, you are actively bringing the toxic, vibrating energy of your stressed out boss directly into your peaceful living room.
I'm infecting the house.
You are. So the intervention is simple, but profoundly difficult. When you pull into your driveway, you put the car in park, you completely turn off the loud engine.
Okay.
And you just sit there in the total silence. Do not touch your phone. Do not check one last email.
For how long?
2 full uninterrupted minutes. You just sit there and consciously breathe. You intentionally feel the heavy weight of your back sinking into the leather car seat. You calmly look at the steering wheel. You look at the front door of your house.
You are intentionally creating a physical buffer zone.
You are aggressively signaling your deeply panicked nervous system. You are calmly looking around and actively proving to your primitive brain, look around. The angry tiger is absolutely not sitting here in this Toyota Camry. We are safely transitioning into a completely entirely new, secure environment.
This entire toolkit ultimately boils down to one fundamental overarching concept that they kept repeating in the data: completing the stress cycle.
Yes. And we have to clearly differentiate between the external stressor and the internal stress.
Right. Explain the critical difference between the two.
The external stressor is the nasty passive-aggressive email from your client. The internal stress is the highly toxic, volatile chemical cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol that is currently rapidly flooding through your biological veins.
So even if I bravely reply to the nasty email, or I completely delete it and resolve the external issue,
the dangerous chemicals are still physically trapped inside your body. The threat is gone, but the biological alarm bells are still deafeningly ringing.
you haven't closed the loop.
You must intentionally flush those toxic chemicals out of your physical system through vigorous movement, through intense crying, through deep gut-busting laughter, or through profound, intentional deep breathing. If you don't aggressively close the biological cycle, the stress just permanently lives inside your tissues.
Wow. Okay, so we have exhaustively covered the deep biology. We have clearly defined a highly practical somatic toolkit.
We have the mechanics down.
Now we really need to pivot and talk about the mental software update, the philosophy required to actually maintain this new baseline, which brings us to Section 7, the philosophical software update.
I love this part, because mechanics alone aren't enough. We have to fundamentally deconstruct our rigid concept of human identity.
The research introduces this incredible visualization called the handful of water analogy.
It is a beautiful Stoic concept. Think about aggressively trying to tightly hold a handful of water.
Okay.
If you desperately construct a highly rigid, unbending identity, for example, if you loudly declare to the world, I am an incredibly hard worker who never ever quits, or conversely, I am a tragic victim of my horrible circumstances.
You are rigidly crunching your fist around the water.
Exactly. And the absolutely tighter you anxiously squeeze your hand to aggressively protect that fragile identity, the faster the water inevitably violently slips right through your fingers.
And the sheer, desperate act of forcefully holding that tight fist constantly creates massive muscular tension.
It creates chronic, systemic, physical inflammation. Because if your entire precarious identity is fundamentally built on the premise that I am a relentless hard worker, then suddenly the simple biological act of taking a nap is rapidly violently perceived as a fatal sin.
It's an existential threat to who I am.
Right. And if you completely define yourself by your historical trauma, then the actual beautiful process of healing is subconsciously perceived as a treasonous betrayal of your own core identity.
Identity absolutely traps you in a cage of your own making.
It does, which is precisely why we desperately need to aggressively adopt a more Stoic mindset. We need to slowly build what the ancient philosophers famously called the inner citadel.
The inner citadel. Let's dig into the core Stoic concept here, which is the famous dichotomy of control.
This is the ruthless, almost violent psychological separation of what is actually within your absolute power versus what is completely, entirely outside of your power.
Your internal actions versus external outcomes.
Right. Let's bring it back to the corporate world. You can meticulously research and flawlessly write the absolute most brilliant, perfect financial report in the entire history of your company. That is your dedicated action.
But the outcome is totally out of my hands.
Your grumpy boss might still just arbitrarily hate the report because he happens to be having a terrible Tuesday and his stomach hurts.
If you deeply emotionally tie your internal biological piece directly to his unpredictable external reaction, you are functionally a helpless slave to random circumstance.
You are completely surrendering the keys to your own nervous system to a person who doesn't even care about you.
This ties perfectly right into what the data calls the lottery lesson.
Yes. Hedonic adaptation.
Explain hedonic adaptation because it ruins our lives.
Massive psychological studies have consistently shown that people who win millions of dollars in the lottery experience a huge euphoric spike in happiness. But within a remarkably few short months, they inevitably, rapidly, aggressively return right back down to their original pre-lottery baseline level of baseline happiness.
If they were naturally a miserable, anxious person before they won the $50 million.
They will quickly become a highly miserable, deeply anxious person who just happens to own a massive yacht.
Why does that happen? Why can't we just be happy when we get the thing we wanted?
Because of a neurological mechanism known as the Hunger Wire. Our primitive brains are biologically hardwired to ensure that we are absolutely never, ever permanently deeply satisfied by any external achievement.
Because satisfaction breeds dangerous complacency, and complacent cavemen get quickly eaten by bears.
Exactly. Evolution demands constant, anxious striving. So chronically chasing that big, shiny promotion or buying that huge new house, firmly believing that it will finally miraculously make you feel safe and calm.
It is a total devastating trap. It's a treadmill that never actually stops.
You will absolutely inevitably take your highly dysregulated nervous system with you wherever you physically go. If you are deeply neurologically wired for chaos and panic, you will flawlessly manage to manufacture chaos and panic, even if you are sitting on a gorgeous, peaceful beach in Bali.
But conversely, if you are securely wired for deep internal peace, you can genuinely, comfortably feel peace, even while standing in a crowded, filthy, screaming subway station.
Because the peace is generated internally, inside the secure citadel, not externally.
This philosophical shift brings us to a really fascinating, highly actionable redefinition of anxiety itself, the concept of psychological time.
This specific concept is a massive, life-altering paradigm shift if you can actually manage to fully grasp it. The fundamental premise is that anxiety is nothing more than the agonizing psychological gap between what is actually happening right now, in this exact second, and what you arrogantly think should be happening in an imaginary future.
So anxiety is essentially just a toxic obsession with a future reality that absolutely does not even physically exist yet.
It is entirely a phantom construct.
So what is the practical strategy to combat that? The data aggressively suggests something they call indifference. But I have to say, indifference sounds incredibly cold. It sounds like giving up.
It's a tricky word, but in this specific context, it absolutely does not mean lazy apathy. It doesn't mean I simply do not care about anything.
Okay, so what does healthy indifference actually look like?
It is a fierce, highly intentional refusal to arrogantly demand that the unpredictable future rigidly look a certain specific way in order for you to be okay.
It's letting go of rigid expectations.
It perfectly aligns with what the ancient Vedic traditions beautifully call karma yoga.
Karma yoga, acting for the sake of the action itself.
Right. You diligently do the hard work simply because it is your authentic, honorable nature to do the hard work. You absolutely do not do the work desperately craving the shiny fruit of the action.
You don't do it just to desperately get the loud applause or the giant bonus check or the external validation.
Because you fundamentally cannot control the applause. If you act purely for the action itself, you are entirely, instantly, totally free.
Wow. Okay, we have covered so much intense ground today. So forcefully bringing this all powerfully together, we are aggressively combining the raw biological nervous system map with the deep grounding philosophical stoicism.
Merging the body and the mind.
We are ultimately fiercely aiming for what we are calling the sovereign body, which brings us to our final section, Section 8.
The ultimate synthesis of all this heavy work is a beautiful concept we call the river flowing.
The river flowing.
The end goal of this entire exhausting journey is absolutely not to magically become a rigid, unfeeling, perfectly calm rock.
Because a rock is basically dead.
The true goal is pure emotional fluidity. It is the robust, resilient capacity to deeply feel the intense stress, to rapidly biologically mobilize to successfully handle it, and then to efficiently, gracefully, completely discharge it and return to baseline.
It's about being deeply alive.
It is about genuinely, freely laughing with your entire physical body and bravely, violently crying with your entire physical body, letting the raw energy flow completely through you without getting dangerously stuck in a stagnant backlog.
And it fundamentally requires us to start intentionally, actively viewing life's inevitable, crushing disappointments completely differently, doesn't it?
Yes. Instead of automatically viewing a massive professional setback or a painful personal rejection as a devastating, cruel curse,
we have to view it as raw data.
you must view it as profoundly useful raw material for your own deep awakening. Every single agonizing trigger is just incredibly valuable, highly specific data, loudly informing you exactly where your window of tolerance is still dangerously too narrow.
It shows you exactly where the heavy armor is still painfully pinching you.
Exactly. It's pointing to the exact specific spot that still desperately needs your gentle attention and healing.
And crucially, we have to constantly, relentlessly remind ourselves about the Phantom War.
This is the most important daily reminder. You are currently violently, fiercely fighting a brutal survival war that effectively ended 10 or 20 years ago in your childhood.
We have to actively look around the modern room and violently realize that there are absolutely zero hidden tigers hiding in the corporate boardroom.
There are literally only emails, just deeply annoying, harmless emails.
And finally, we have to talk about the terrifying power of simple boredom.
Pure boredom is the ultimate secret doorway to the actual soul.
It really is, but we actively, aggressively avoid it like the literal plague.
If you can just manage to bravely sit completely still in the uncomfortable, quiet boredom, if you can successfully, aggressively resist the frantic, buzzing urge to immediately, endlessly scroll through social media or rapidly, desperately pick a toxic fight to get a quick adrenaline hit,
If you can survive the agonizing withdrawal of the hum,
then you are finally actually truly entirely free. Because that quiet, terrifying, profoundly empty space is the exact specific place where you finally, truly, intimately meet your authentic self.
This has been an absolutely massive, completely paradigm-shifting conversation. I intensely want to leave the listener with one final, practical, deeply challenging call to action today.
I love a good challenge. Let's hear it.
The very next time, which might literally be in 10 minutes, that you physically feel that terrifying, crawling urge rapidly bubbling up inside you, the frantic urge to aggressively rush, the desperate urge to mindlessly deeply check the phone, the toxic urge to completely spiral into micro-worry.
When you clearly feel the old heavy armor desperately trying to snap back into place.
Exactly. When that happens, I challenge you to abruptly, forcefully, physically pause, aggressively, ruthlessly look deeply inward, and intentionally, consciously, purposefully give your own physical body the deep safety signal.
Look directly into your own biology and gently, calmly tell your terrified body, we are fundamentally entirely safe right now.
And you have to actually physically, aggressively prove it to the primitive brain. Prove it with your slow, deep, intentional breath. Prove it with your radical, terrifying, heavy stillness.
You are the sole competent operator of this incredibly complex biological machine. It is time to actively, forcefully, intentionally pull your tight hands completely off the glowing red panic button.
Put your hands securely, firmly right back onto the steering wheel of your own life. Just deeply breathe. Stop violently fighting the ghost. Let the loud refrigerator hum quietly, finally, completely, permanently die, and patiently, confidently let your deeply exhausted biological baseline finally, profoundly, fundamentally shift.
And just let it all go. Let the heavy armor aggressively, completely fall all the way entirely off.
Thanks for diving so intensely deeply with us today. This has been absolutely phenomenal. We'll proudly see you on Confidently back here right exactly next time.
Be safely well, everyone.